What's this coming through the line? A Lucky Paper Radio, not on a Monday? What's going on? This is a crazy thing. What's happening?
What are we doing here? I was having a normal Monday, and then...
Did you just speak before I introduced you? You never do that. That's against the rules of the podcast.
You surprised me with this record.
Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony. Too soon for another nickname, Maddox. What's up, Anthony?
Not too much. How you doing, Andy?
Good. We're not alone, Anthony. There's another person among us. We're here this week with the Galileo of Cube, or the Anaximander of Cube maybe is more appropriate. Jet Crowdis. What's up, Jet?
Who the hell is that?
So Anaximander, I've been listening to this podcast called Philosophize This, which I can't really...
Sounds like a podcast you would listen to.
I don't know how to take that. I can't really recommend this show It's not a great podcast, but what it is just a dude who's like a philosophy professor that has got like big dad joke energy, just talking about the history of philosophy chronologically in like little 30-minute podcast episodes. And one of the earliest episodes is about this guy named Anaximander, who was a big Greek philosopher dude. And one of the things he did was invent the idea of maps. What if we made a map of the world, was what he said. And that's what you did, your name's not Map, it's Jet. That's what you did, Jet, for the Cube community. We're bringing you a special episode just to tell you about a new tool from your friends at Lucky Paper, the Cube Map. What is the Cube Map, Jet?
Well, the Cube Map is a map of cubes.
Why would one do this? Why would you make a map of cubes? I can't go to cubes.
The idea for this came from our discussions asking each other, what sort of is cube and what is the diversity of cube? Because I think cube has a very specific meaning to a bunch of different people. I think for most people, cube kind of means the MTGO vintage cube, right? And that is sort of traditionally what many people think of when
it is the most visible
cube
cube for sure.
Yeah. But of course, in the cube community, many of us are far more invested. And so we have different ideas of what cube can be, whether that's our own environments or environments that might be different than ours, right? There are set cubes. There are cubes that are built around a specific mechanic. And I have always been really curious. And I think, we at Lucky Paper have always been really curious about what is the spectrum of that within the cube universe. And so essentially the Cube Map is designed to show that. And so the way that we did this is we partnered with Cube Cobra. We are very thankful. Gave us all 20,000 cubes that exist on their website. And then we did some math to essentially transform the cubes based on the cards that they play into this two-dimensional map.
People often assume once you're in the enfranchised cube community that almost everybody is playing some variation of like a legacy vintage cube, right? Like everyone's playing Lightning Bolt, everyone's playing Counterspell, and there's all of this language within the cube world where people will call things a cube staple, or they say like, this is a shoo-in at 540, and what they're saying is that like, obviously we're all playing the best cards, and so if you're playing the top 540 best cards, this card's good enough to fit in that category. And I've always wondered, and we've mused before about like, what percentage of the cube community is actually playing vintage or legacy style cubes that we're talking about, and how does that relate to the rest of the cube world? And is the rest of the cube world really just pauper and peasant cubes and then this big block of legacy and vintage cubes, or are there other little enclaves out there? And so really, to me, this map is really revolutionary. I think it's going to totally change the way people think about what the cube community is, and what it really shows, I think, very vividly, is the huge breadth of what is currently represented in the cube design world, and also the breadth of possibilities of what could be.
I think we've gone on a little bit too long without just telling people, this is live. Go look at it. Go to luckypaper.co, click on the button that says map, and poke around on it. It is such an exciting tool. We've been working really hard on it. And as much as I just want to talk and wax and wane about how it works, what it looks like, how much fun it is, it's so much easier for you to just go look at it.
Yeah, so we'll pause the podcast now. You go look at it. I don't know. The first time we looked at it interactively, we spent like a couple hours on it. So I guess we'll see you in a few hours. You can come back and start the podcast again and pick up where you left off.
Yeah, I remember when Anthony first put together the interactive visualization, I was like, oh my God, this is way cooler than I thought it would ever be.
It's funny because I didn't really have a model for your workflow, Jet, but like you would generate these big images essentially of these maps of what the cube world looked like, but you couldn't then say, well, what is that dot? Because you had no way to do that. You just made a big image. Now you have to like specifically write some programming if you want to go through and actually label specific nodes in that map and figure out what different sections of the map are. And so, yeah, once we got it interactive and it was actually on the testing server and you could go on and actually mouse over and view all the cubes dynamically in real time, I'm sure it was a big revelation for you.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you mentioned sort of you hinted at the workflow that was used to generate those initial maps, so to speak. And I think it's worth maybe mentioning briefly at a high level how the map was made. And so along with the release of the map, we've also released an article where I go a little bit more in depth in talking about the math behind the cube map itself. But essentially the cube map is designed to be, it's a two-dimensional representation of sort of a high-dimensional space that is the cube universe. And so what do I mean by that, right?
Yeah, what's a high-dimensional space, Jet?
Excellent question,
Let's all get
Andy.
into Jet's TARDIS and he'll give us a tour.
Yeah, exactly. So in this context, sort of one dimension is a card, right? And so when we think about how to represent cubes as data, right? Because you need sort of a unified framework to compare cubes. I think a really intuitive way and sort of the way that we decided to go was for any individual card, if a cube has that card, then it gets a 1 in that sort of position, in that dimension. And if it doesn't have the card, then it gets a 0, right? And so there are a little over 21,000 different unique cards represented on Cube Cobra, right? So any individual cube is essentially 21,000 zeros and ones based on the cards that it contains, right? So for example, my cube, right, it's a 450 cube. It would have 450 ones at the individual positions for the cards, right? And so that's sort of the high dimensional part of that data. There are like 21,000 dimensions to the data. But of course, we can't visualize 21,000 different dimensions. We can't even visualize more than 3. And so the exercise of making the cube map was, how do we preserve relationships that exist in this high dimensional space, right? So for example, 2 sort of MTGO vintage style cubes, right, will be close together in this 21,000 dimensional space. How do we preserve their closeness together down to 2 dimensions? And so the way that that was done is essentially called projection. So you can imagine you took like a globe, right? A globe is like a 3D object. If you flattened it, you would get some representation of the way that countries look, right? And that's a 2D representation. It's a 2D representation of a 3D object. Another good example, I think, is your shadow, right? Your shadow is a 2-dimensional projection of your 3D body. And so that's essentially what the map is. It's kind of, in some sense, a shadow of this big cube universe that's really high dimensional.
Yeah, I mean, is it fair to describe that sort of exercise of finding a practical projection as kind of like just trying to rotate an object until you get the most useful shadow? Like, you know, turning your head until you just get to see all the details of your profile rather than just the blob of your head face on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy, with the caveat being that it's not quite so straightforward because the relationships that exist in very high dimensional space, and particularly in this data set, are very complicated. And I go into this a little bit in the article if it interests you. The projection that we ended up using is a non-linear projection. And so what I mean by that is it doesn't actually preserve all of the relationships that exist in 21,000 dimensional space. It only preserves some of them. It preserves the relationships between cubes that are close together. And so, you know, for example, on the map, you will see the location of a bunch of islands, right? Islands that represent different cube types. So like the degenerate microcubes are their own little island.
Woohoo!
Hooray! Yeah, Andy is finally excited for that. The location of that island is essentially arbitrary because they are all very related to each other, but they are very unrelated to all of the other cubes on the map. And so those sort of distances are not preserved. And so making the map is very subjective. And I think it's worth emphasizing that. This is just sort of one way of visualizing the cube universe that cannot hope to fully recapitulate all the relationships that exist. It's just sort of one framing of that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at different projections, essentially, of this data that you were generating for months and giving you feedback on them and saying, like, well, I can't really make any sense of this, or this doesn't match what I would expect to see, and having all these conversations about how we were tweezing out just the right amount of density and connections between cubes that it really sort of felt like a representation of the world that we've come to know. So it is subjective in that sense, but I do want to emphasize that like the TLDR on this for me, if you don't care to understand all of the math, is that all of these nodes were positioned with objective math that we chose, right? I mean, obviously you could choose any one of another set of objective maths, but like we didn't move any of these nodes around. We didn't place any of them where we thought they belonged. They're all placed with this objective math system that is deterministic with a given set of settings. And
based specifically on the cards in the cube, not based on any other data about it.
Right. That's the other thing I was going to say, is the only data we used was the actual cards in the list. We didn't use the category on Cube Cobra, whether it was a vintage or a pauper cube. We didn't use any of that. We didn't use the name, just the actual cards in the list. And it's really quite remarkable. I keep having little moments of going over the map and just being shocked that, like, you know, you find a little enclave and it's just all of the budget cubes. And you're like, how is it that all of the budget cubes share enough cards that there's a bunch of budget cubes kind of all clustered in this little node in the middle of the map? It's like, we didn't put the budget cubes there, but here we are, a bunch of cubes that are named budget because they just happen to share cards that way. And we do start to naturally see kind of a big, like the big mass of like what our vintage and our legacy cubes kind of has like a bleeding edge, right? Where it doesn't have a clear definition on one side. It just kind of tapers off into other little tendrils and things. And that's where all the cubes like Anthony's, which, Anthony, your cube is not restricted by any rarity. It's not restricted by any, legality in a particular format. But you are not playing at those extreme power level limits. And so your cube is in one of these sort of sea of cubes that are kind of flowing off of that main island. And then we have another big island for Peasant, a big island for EDH and Commander cubes, a big island for Pauper, and then all kinds of little tiny islands all over the place that are really, really fun to explore.
My cube is actually not in the big pile of legacy cubes. It's sort of in the Pauper island, but trending towards that direction, just kind of on the outskirts of it.
Yeah, I mean, those are really the big takeaways. The close distances are more likely to be meaningful than the long distances, as Jet said. So the exact placement of specific islands on the overall map are not necessarily meaningful. Like, for example, the X and Y axis have no meaning on this map, right? Like, being in the top left versus the bottom right is completely meaningless. What is meaningful is the relationships of the cubes to one another, especially within a close neighborhood. That's when it gets really meaningful. And then some of the islands are kind of placed somewhat coincidentally, but all the sort of connected masses that are all, kind of woven into one another are all there just based on the cards within the cube. And I think what we really want this to be is a discovery tool for people that just want to know what other kinds of cubes exist. Oftentimes there are people that are interested in playing cube but don't have the drive to build their own cube. It's not interesting or fun to them to build their own cube, and so they want to just kind of take a list and use it. And this is a great tool, I think, for finding a cube that interests you and using it. And as a cube designer, just being able to see, here's my cube, here are all of the cubes surrounding my cube, and then just kind of as I zoom out and get further away, you can see how different philosophies and different underlying reasonings and ideas for what cards should be included start pulling in different directions. And you can start to say, well, I'm actually drawn more to this or that. And you can actually start to really see where your philosophy lands you on this map. Who are your neighbors? Who are you closer to and further from? And it's really interesting to see that, like, Jet, you and I, and now Anthony too, I think kind of have been on this one Discord for a long time. And something I noticed immediately when we put this map together was that really a lot of people I would consider like my friends in the community, people I've been talking to about Cube for years, we're kind of all in the same little peninsula, right? Like, it's not surprising that all of our conversations together, even though we could talk to each other and articulate clear distinctions in our philosophy and how we approach our own individual cubes.
Yeah, it is really funny, actually.
There is this underlying something, right, that is drawing us together, and at the very least, just the sort of bias of having conversations with one another, resulting in similar cards being run. And you can see some of these other peninsulas that kind of have grown out of it. So I don't know. I'm so excited about this because Cube is my favorite format, shocking no one. And other constructed formats, like, have kind of the equivalent of this, I think, in just like the meta pages. So if you go to MTG Goldfish or MTG Top 8 and look at the meta breakdowns within Modern or Legacy or Standard at a given time, you can really see the landscape of like, here's what Standard looks like. Standard right now is 20% Sultai and 4% Boros, and it's got this much aggro, this much control, and you can get like a sense of what that format looks like. Cube, by nature of being much more casual, not having a centralized database of decks to get pulled from. There's not a bunch of deck lists on MTGO from Cube, obviously, that get passed down through the system like this. We don't have a sense of that. And also, it doesn't make sense for it to be like a ranked meta the way it is in constructed formats. What makes sense for us, for our format, is this sprawling map. It's not that the percentages matter. It's not that, oh, we're 10% vintage or whatever. All that matters is that there's all these beautiful, varied ways to play Cube, and they are just visualized for you and thrown out on this canvas, which I think is a perfect metaphor for what the format means relative to other constructed formats.
Yeah, it's funny. I know that Anthony and I had the sort of a similar musing, which is that there were lots of times we were in the Discord or in the Cube community more generally, and someone would have been like, oh, has anyone designed X kind of cube? And we were sitting on this map and kind of screaming internally, like, yes, there's a whole cluster of cubes that are just what you want. But we couldn't show it off. And so I'm really excited to be able to do that.
And what really makes it such an interesting tool, like as a search tool, is if you're asking that question, has anybody made a monocolored cube, or has anyone made an all artifacts cube? Even if people haven't, added detailed descriptions and added tags to make them searchable directly on Cube Cobra, if you can just find one, or even, you start with the Mirrodin cluster of cubes and, scoot around and find that artifact cluster, you can find all of these different variations that just cluster together naturally based on the cards that are there.
Yeah, the little artifact cluster was so interesting to me because at the center of this little corner of the map was just artifact cubes that were mostly artifacts, and then there was a little branch for devoid cubes, which are artifacts but also lots of colorless cards that are not artifacts, and then there was a branch for Mirrodin set cubes, and there was a branch for Kaladesh set cubes. All of these sets that essentially revolved around artifacts were clustered naturally with the actual artifact cubes that were either entirely artifacts or very heavily artifact themed. Just the idea that all these things end up actually kind of connecting on this vast continuum, I think makes it really interesting. Because that, like you said, Anthony, you can be like, I'm interested in an artifact cube, and then you find this section of the map, and then you get to realize, well, actually, do I really want a devoid cube, or a Mirrodin cube, or a Kaladesh cube, or one of these other flavors of this kind of thing that I'm interested in, and really see the full variety on display for you.
Yeah, it was really fun to sort of find all of the emergent design philosophies that I'd never considered. Just earlier today, I actually found the cluster of cubes designed around bears, 2/2s for 2. And so I found that to be really funny and also really cool.
I'm just really excited to see what people discover, and I hope people will send in their favorite, most interesting little islands buried in the cube map.
Absolutely, yeah. We've made the map pretty easily shareable, so you can share a link to a specific cube or a specific set of cubes. So send a link to your playgroup and say, hey, look, this is where our cube is, and then let people explore.
We're going to be talking about this, I am sure, on the show quite a bit in the future. So check out the map so you can keep up with all the conversations I'm sure that will come up. Because, like I said, I think this is, I don't want to build Jet up too much because I really prefer to roast Jet rather than
you really shouldn't
than give him compliments or grow his ego even more. But I do really think that this is kind of like a big changing point for the community, because for the first time, we've mused and speculated about what does the Cube community look like. I mean, Anthony and I have talked about who is the audience for our podcast. We're making this show about Cube. What percentage of those people are just playing, some variation of the MTGO cube? What percentage have designed their own cube from scratch? And then what is the scope of those cubes? I know that we've talked with John at Cultic Cube about the same thing. He's always wondered when he's making his videos, how much context should I give to the things I'm saying? What kind of audience should I be preparing for? And having this thing where it's here it is, it's visualized. Cube Cobra, I mean, it's not the only game in town. Obviously, there's quite a few cube designers or maybe still on Cube Tutor, but I think the sort of trend is very strongly towards Cube Cobra, and I imagine that we are catching the vast majority of people that have a cube and take it even remotely seriously. Anybody that's got their map on Cobra is part of this map, and I think that's a really great visualization of our community.
It's worth mentioning. I don't know if it's worth mentioning. People can look it up. Not every cube is on there, right?
Right.
Every statement has a big asterisk on it on the internet.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, what did we end up excluding? We ended up excluding really tiny cubes because a lot of them, the vast majority of them, weren't cubes. They were just lists of cards people had made and then abandoned. And we excluded cards.
It's funny.
Cubes that were
It's funny you
unlisted on
mentioned
Cube
that,
Cobra.
actually. Yeah, unlisted. Minimum of 50 unique cards with only 2 thresholds, and then obviously filtered out duplicates. It's actually funny that you mentioned that because I'm pretty sure that there's a cluster defined by exclusively lands, just like fetches and shock lands, that are mostly cubes that people start building, and they add all the lands, and then they just stop.
The island
It's sort
of
of just
misfit
like a
toys.
pile of scaffolding.
Yeah, it's actually a fairly large cluster, and you can like click on it, and you can see that someone added 4 cycles of duels, and then 5 white cards, and then stopped.
Hey, that's enough to get past the threshold, though. So
Yeah.
so it's on the map.
It's true.
Now, what are the cubes are surrounding those really half-baked cubes, and are they also...
The lands cluster, the like lands focused cubes are there.
That makes a lot of sense, Jet. That makes a lot of sense. All right, that's it for this bonus episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm not going to do all the stuff I normally do, but thanks for tuning in. We'll be back on Monday with a regular episode. And in the meantime, go check out that cube map. Click around. You deserve it. Nothing? Say anything? Anybody?
No, I mean that sounded good to me.
All right, great. Well, let's end it there then. Fine.
Can you do a Star Trek quote? Because it's like a voyage.
Star Trek Voyager.
Do a Star Trek quote?
Do a map pun.
The T. That's my favorite Star Trek quote.
I don't watch Star Trek because that's a boomer show.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, what can I say? We're boomers.